Hi, wanted to welcome you back to a week 2 preview of what we're going to do this week in class. And so the very first thing I want to talk about is what we did last week in class. So we're going to look at our objectives, and our objectives include for this coming lecture to discuss the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act and how it impacts pharmacy practice with both medications and food. And then also what we're going to do is talk about create a plan for a new drug to kind of show how it changed over time. So be thinking about, as you prepare for the class, what's a new drug that you'd like to come up with name and generic name and an indication, some cool side effects. And we're going to progress that through the original type of act that we had regulating drugs and move it into the current way that we regulate drugs. And then finally, we're going to also discuss during this little pre-lecture some of the ways that malpractice can be avoided in your pharmacy setting. So kind of a little rehash of what we did last week. So remember, when we talk about the key concepts of malpractice, there's always the big four that have to be done. You have to show a duty, you have to breach that duty, there must be damages, and there must be proof that you caused those damages. Without any of those four, then you can't really have a malpractice claim. So remember when we talked about it also, we specifically said at the end of the lecture some of the key things that have to be shown for malpractice in Louisiana. And so in reality, there's only two different ways that we can have malpractice in Louisiana. As we discussed in class, both one, you can either have a misfill of some sort, so the wrong drug to the wrong patient, or you could fail to notify a prescriber about a potentially toxic or lethal dose. Those are the really two things that must be proven to have a malpractice claim inside the state of Louisiana. Kind of one of those key concepts from the last lecture. So just don't forget though, if you fail to counsel or fail to label properly, that might not be constituted as malpractice and result in a large settlement. It can result in board action, and you don't want that either. So let's go ahead and go into what the material is for this week. We're going to be talking about the different pharmacy laws and the different things that have shaped how we practice pharmacy and how we get drugs to market. Specifically today, we're looking at the marketing of drugs. So starting back with the original act, which is the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906, we've progressed through several different amendments and new ways that the acts have been imported. We've changed the way that the FDA has worked. We've done several things over these last 109 years to how we regulate pharmaceuticals in the U.S. These are just a simple listing of some of them. We're going to cover these more so in class, but I wanted to go ahead and introduce the original act so that we can go ahead and start with our project. So prior to 1906, the really history of food regulation, at least, not necessarily drug, but food regulation started in the colonies where they had certain aspects of certain qualities of foods that had to be present for them to be allowed to be sold. And if they weren't, they got rid of them or were not allowed to be sold. So in 1848 was one of our first laws talking about drugs and medications and things used for medicinal purposes, and we banned the importation of it. Kind of interesting, that's our first step. Then in 1886, there was a big debate over butter versus margarine. If you ever wondered, margarine is not a real food-like product. You can't go make it from natural food substances. And that was the argument, was that at this time, the people who made butter, so the dairy farmers, wanted to make only butter and not have margarine around because it would actually had better qualities for spreading, was easier to use, and so they were fearful it would come into their market. So they sued it, claiming that it was not really a food product. And then finally, came to a head in 1905, but there was meat issues that had become also problems. As we got bigger and we had bigger cattle yards and bigger cattle processing plants, there wasn't a lot of regulation that dealt with how do those cows get processed and what type of environments. And so that developed our Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906. So the things that, even though it dealt with food, it also dealt with medications. What's interesting, if you pull up this act, and when we think about how complex laws are, this act is only a few pages long. And so when we think of the Patient Protection Act or the Insurance Act of 2010, which was over 2,500 pages long, it's kind of interesting with how little bit of regulation was on these products. And this is the first step. So before that, there really wasn't any. So we talked about numerous concoctions that were available. You know, when we think of snake oils and things like that, there was unknown ingredients. They were either not listed, or the things that they were on there, they didn't have to be truthful in how they listed them. They only if they wanted to. And so this act sought to fix some of that. And advertising was also unlimited. You could claim it however you wanted it. Everything was free game. So the purpose of this act was to reduce the risk to the public and try to make what was on the bottle, what was really in the bottle, try to make claims being made and everything like that to be more factual so that the public could make an informed decision. They also wanted to reduce the misbranding of ingredients. As I mentioned before, there was really no legislation that said what you put on the bottle had to be in the bottle. And so you could list gold in there if you wanted to, and it may in fact contain gold, or it may contain nothing, or it may contain arsenic. It really wasn't clear, so that's one of the things. Also reducing unfounded claims, because if you look back at some of the old ads, the snake oil salesmen, as we called them, they could cure anything. And then also set standards for purity, so that if you claim to have this much of a drug in it, you had to have that much and nothing else, which was a little bit different. With this act, we also saw some of the changing in the evolution of the Food and Drug Administration, which at this time was still a bureau of the Department of Chemistry within the Department of Agricultural, a Bureau of Chemistry within the Department of Ag. And so as we can kind of see from this slide, over time, it progressed from being this one part within the Department of Agriculture to essentially becoming its own large section under the Department of Health and Human Services, where it is now. And so it's interesting to see as we get more progressive with each of these laws, when we talk about the FDC of 1938, and as we go further with the Kefauver-Harris Amendment of 1962, we see that along with that, the FDA is being strengthened to where it is now. Some people say it's too strong now, some people say it's not strong enough. We'll talk more about that as we go through today's lecture and as we finish up the next 3 lectures, which really have a lot to do with what the FDA does. So going back to that Pure Food and Drug Act, what did it actually accomplish? Well, the way that it was written, it said if it was printed on the bottle, it had to be true. So manufacturers just deleted from the bottle what was in it. It didn't say they had to be there. It just said if listed, they must be true. So then the labels went blank. There was nothing the FDA could do to stop the claims, because at this point, the wording only allowed for misbranding. And before you could brand something, you had to misbrand, you had to brand. And so they stopped putting things on the actual labels claiming all these things, and they would say them, or they would have a different handout. And there was really no way around this. And a lot of people were starting to claim First Amendment rules are being violated because they should have the right to say that Jeff's snake oil cures cancer if they want to say that. And the FDA at the time, which was still, remember, just a Bureau of Chemistry section, was there saying, no, you're not allowed to do that. And also we see that cosmetics and medical devices are not included with the Pure Food and Drug Act. So then came about the case of U.S. v. Johnson. And so Johnson was the maker of a solution that cured cancer, arthritis, and most other ailments. So otherwise, it was a really good drug. Unfortunately, there was no proof that it was there. As I mentioned before, Johnson was one of the many who actually created a First Amendment defense, saying that they have the freedom of speech to say what they want. However, their ruling was from the U.S. Supreme Court really didn't hinge on that. And essentially what it said was that the law did not cover false or misleading efficacy claims. And so that limited what the particular act could do, and the fact that the way that it was written, false or misbranding, it really didn't make efficacy claims. It really only focused in on the ingredients listed. And so it continued to allow them to say what they want. So then we saw the amendment of 1912, which basically prohibits false or fraudulent efficacy claims. But at this time, the burden of proof was still on the U.S. government. So instead of the drug maker or concoction maker being required to document that their drug did these things or was even safe, that's going to be important when we go forward into 1938, was that the government had to be the one to prove that they were not safe or were not effective. And so you see that innocent until proven guilty mentality. And with that, we're going to conclude this. So very short today, because there's also this other video that I'm going to want you to watch. And it deals with something that we're going to talk as our extra subject for the day, which is guns and pharmacies. So be thinking about that. I'm going to put the link to the video right here. It's also on Moodle if you need it. And so with that, I'm going to close. Be prepared tomorrow. Think about, as I mentioned at the beginning of the lecture, any type of drug that you'd like to make up, because we're going to take that through the different steps of the changing federal regulations. So thank you so much. Hope you enjoyed the video. I'll see you in class on Tuesday. Here is the video that I asked that you watch. It's only about 4.5 minutes long, but feel free to click at any time. Take care. Click it. Just use your mouse. Why are you still watching this? Hello? Click yes. Click it.